You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 9th of May 2024 on Monocle Radio.
The EU contrives a means of making Russia pay for Ukraine's defence. Would wider recognition of Palestine make any difference to anything? And does anyone fancy a summer holiday in Afghanistan? I'm Andrew Mueller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Mueller. My guests, Sir William Patey and Dr. Marion Messmer, will discuss today's big stories, and our weekly letter from is a letter from Mexico City. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I am joined today by Sir William Patey, former British ambassador to Afghanistan, Sudan, Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and by Dr. Marion Messmer, senior research fellow in international security at Chatham House. Hello to you both.
Hi, good to be back.
Marion, it's not your first time here. You must be up to your second or third by now.
I think this is third, yeah.
OK. Well, you have recently been, as I understand it, discussing nuclear policy. Are we all doomed?
When we're talking nuclear, I think the doom is never too far off. But it's actually been really interesting to see how much closer the alliance, that is NATO, has got ever since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I actually really enjoyed the conference, as far as you can say that when you're talking about nuclear weapons.
Did they at least manage to hold this grim conference in an agreeable setting?
It was really interesting. It was in Skopje, in North Macedonia, not a place I'd ever been to before. But the Balkans are a very beautiful region, and the North Macedonians were really keen to actually show us their city, show us their country, and I really enjoyed that.
Almost impossible to eat badly in that part of the world as well. Much the same could be said of Sicily, William, where you have been.
Yes, I was on an Epicurean tour of Sicily from Palermo to Syracuse.
How awful.
It was terrible. I had fresh tomatoes off the plant, lovely Modica chocolate made just with cocoa and sugar and lovely wine. It was absolutely gorgeous, and also educational, because I was inducted into apparently the mafia are a bad thing according to the.
You were inducted into the mafia?
No, I was inducted into the.
I'm pretty sure that's something you should keep quiet.
No, I was inducted into the idea that the mafia is a bad thing, in case anyone thought it was a good thing.
Okay.
An anti-mafia museum in Corleone.
It would be interesting if they opened a pro-mafia museum across the street, perhaps. Let people make their own decisions.
Exactly.
We will start with Ukraine, and for a possible step forward for a much-discussed means of raising funds for its defence, somehow utilising Russian assets frozen in European banks. While there has been considerable angst about the propriety of seizing these assets wholesale, it has been suggested that using the interest and other profits they generate might not be too much of a liberty. The EU has today approved a plan of this sort after Belgium, where considerable Russian assets are parked in the securities depository Euroclear, dropped its objections. Perhaps €3 billion annually of what is effectively Russia's income will now be spent buying weapons for Ukraine. William, there is something poetic sounding about this. Does this seem fair enough?
It seems fair enough to me, I have to say. The Americans have been pressing the Europeans to go much further and use the assets themselves to fund Ukraine. They've taken a partial step by just the interest or the earnings of these assets. And I think what is rich in this is that apparently I didn't realise till I read this today that the Belgians have been collecting the tax on these earnings, and then which is equivalent to the amount of money they were giving the Ukrainians as aid. So they were double counting. They were suggesting that they were giving billions to Ukraine in aid when it was actually the tax they were collecting from Russian assets.
Marion, is this really as far as anybody should go? William did mention there that the US, among others, have been pressing for just seizing Russia's assets and spending those on Ukraine, either to defend Ukraine or rebuild Ukraine. The argument against it is fairly understandable, i.e. that these assets do not belong to the Russian regime but to the Russian state and therefore its people, and also perhaps you set a somewhat unhappy precedent if you just start taking the stuff of people who've annoyed you.
That's been really hotly discussed, including on the Chatham House website, where we actually recently published if you will, a pro and a con piece. One argued by one of our colleagues who's an economist, and one argued by one of our colleagues who's a Russia expert. And they came to different conclusions very much on the basis of their training. I mean, I'm not an economist, so from my perspective, I would very much agree that it seems fair enough to use these funds, or to use the interest of these funds to support Ukraine. But at the same time, I understand that colleagues who are economists are very concerned about the potential impact that this might have on the global economy, on questions around property. So it's probably not as straightforward, because few things ever are. But in the interest of letting people make up their own minds, I would signpost to the Chatham House website so that they can read those two pieces.
Very cunningly plugged. William, is Europe in particular perhaps still a bit spooked about the idea of being seen to impose punitive reparations, or stealing people's stuff, or taking people's stuff, thinking back to 1918, when, of course, massively punitive reparations were imposed on Germany with what many historians would argue were unhappy consequences?
Yes, I mean, the reparations, that of course, reparations come about once you're defeated. I mean, there may well be a case if the war is brought to an end and Ukraine survives, that there is a claim against Russia for reparations for the damage they've caused in an illegal invasion. So there's a lot of historical precedent for some of this. Not all of it great. I mean, I can see you can see the arguments about the sanctity of people's property. You want people to invest in different countries. You don't want them to make them to think that your investments are going to be liable to political entanglement. But the Russian invasion is a kind of rather unique event in the 21st century in Europe, anyway, and it may be a case for special measures. I think this is a halfway house. You're basically saying these assets have been frozen, but they're actually earning income. Use the income, and it also helps the European countries who've been reluctant to fully support Ukraine in supplying arms. It allows them some way of agreeing to support Ukraine without compromising their what I would call not necessarily pro-Russian stance, but ambivalent stance towards Russia.
Marion, we have also seen this week a further round of sanctions introduced by the EU against Russia, and it's kind of amazing after more than 2 years that they're still finding things they haven't previously sanctioned. But it turns out that one of them is Russia's LNG sector. That hasn't been sanctioned before. It is going to be sanctioned now. But again, 2.5 years nearly now into this, the sanctions have not crippled Russia's economy. They have not brought the ruble to its knees. Is there an argument that they're kind of what you do instead of actually doing something?
I think sanctions have their place, but I think if we look at the sanctions on Russia, they've not had the effect that anyone had hoped. I think in part that is because Russia has invested so much in its military economy. They've essentially flipped their economy onto a war footing, which means that, the Russian government is propping up much of the economy. And I don't know how long-term sustainable that is. Their energy income has really reduced, and a lot of states that used to import Russian oil and gas have completely made the switch to other resources. But at the same time, Russia has also been very good at actually developing new relationships with other states, which has helped them also evade sanctions. And also, if we look at the international comparison, we've got states like North Korea or Iran who have been under sanctions more or less for decades, and they are still going, and they have also, unfortunately, really learned how to evade sanctions, and these are some of the states that Russia is now closer with, and we know that those governments are also helping Russia evade sanctions. So I think we need to think a lot more about what else could be done, how those sanctions could be strengthened, and how perhaps sanctions could also indirectly be applied perhaps to North Korea, perhaps to Iran, to make sure that Russia really feels the full effect of those sanctions.
Just finally on this, William, thinking back to your diplomatic experience, are you a sanctions enthusiast? Because it has been my general experience of reporting from places that were under one kind of sanction or another, that they do tend not so much to bother the people who the sanctions are really targeted against, but the people over whom they are presiding, for whom life just becomes that little bit harder.
Well, my very first job in the Foreign Office was overseeing sanctions against Rhodesia, which became became Zimbabwe, and that was a singular failure to change the actions of the Ian Smith regime in Rhodesia at the time. I think our experience of sanctions over the years is that they don't bring about a change of behaviour. Probably the only case where that's happened is South Africa, I think, where prolonged sanctions and international opprobrium did produce a change of policy, as in a combination with other things. So sanctions never has, in my view, changed the behaviour. But they are an alternative to war. They send a very strong political signal. And that's their use. They allow politicians in countries who disapprove of other people's behaviour to do something that's stronger than words and short of military action. So they have a place, but we shouldn't pretend that they're going to solve anything.
Well, let's move along to Palestine, which is at present recognised as a country by fully 142 of the 193 members of the United Nations. That number swelled in recent weeks by gestures of solidarity made by Barbados, the Bahamas, Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. It is now being reasonably plausibly reported that later this month, several EU member states will extend Palestine the same courtesy, including Ireland, Spain, Norway, Slovenia and Malta. 8 other EU countries have already made the move. The tricky bit is likely to remain convincing the United States, which vetoed Palestine's accession to full UN membership as recently as April 19th. Marion, we'll get into the ramifications of full recognition of Palestine shortly, but this initiative that is being reported, these 5 more EU members recognising Palestine, will that make any difference to anything?
Yes and no. I think it will make a difference in the sense that it shows to what extent Israel's military action in Gaza is increasingly being seen as being disproportionate. And I think that might be important in terms of support for the Israeli government. But at the same time, it doesn't change that much in terms of the facts on the ground. You know, even if Palestine was to be recognized as a state, there is still the issue of territory. There's still the issue of just the extent to which Palestine, is now essentially devastated after Israeli military action, and then there's also the question of what Palestinian government. There are lots of questions that would still need to be answered, and so I think it's a gesture of solidarity. It's a gesture of disapproval of Israeli military action, but in terms of practical measures, I don't think it does that much.
There are a lot of questions there, which I will ball up into one, which I will put to you, William, which is, when we do recognise Palestine, or if we do recognise Palestine, what are we actually recognising?
Well, you'll be recognising the territory of Gaza and the West Bank, which is under some form of Palestinian control. I mean, the recognition issue has always been one that certain Britain has been prepared to consider recognition. And I remember having a conversation with William Hague about when we would do it. The principle is there that and his view was that we would do it at a time that would most help the peace process, and that's always been the argument that
this would be a carrot. This
would be a carrot, or be part of the peace process, be part of a process towards a two-state solution. The unfortunate thing is that it's always given Israel a veto on that. So I think it's significant if Spain and Malta and Slovenia and Norway and Portugal, these would be the first European states to recognise Palestine since 1988. The group of European states who recognised it did so at the same time as the Soviet Union in 1988, when they were behind the Iron Curtain. So this would be a new grouping of democratic states saying, let's recognise Palestine. The tactic up to now has been to build a Palestinian state up from the ground. So the attempt was to make the Palestinian Authority give it the wherewithal to run a state, even although it didn't yet have recognition. That probably has not been a great success. Most people would agree. So there's a movement that says, can we do this from the top down? And the rationale for it is that Palestine would then, if Palestine was recognised as a state by most countries, it's already recognised by most countries, but if it was recognised by the UN as a UN member, it would be negotiating with Israel as an equal, essentially about its borders, and that could give a huge impetus to peace talks and about a permanent solution once this terrible war is over, and it will end one day, and then we're still going to be left with the debris of Gaza and the problems of the West Bank. How do you deal with that? Is a two-state solution dead? Is it a one-state? Most people have been saying now we need to revitalise the two-state solution, and recognition would have a part to play in that process.
Is there an argument against it right now, though, Marion, in the idea being that if you recognise Palestine now when you hadn't recognised it previously, you are to some level rewarding Hamas, and particularly rewarding Hamas's monstrous behaviour on October 7th?
It's an interesting question. I don't think so, because I don't think that that's the motivation behind the states that are considering that. You know, they're not considering it on October 8th.
I don't think that's why they're doing it, but I'm just wondering if the timing makes it seem like that.
Yeah, I don't know, because we are quite far from October 7 now, and you know, William mentioned all the destruction in Gaza, and I think that is really the motivation behind it. I see where you're coming from, but I don't think that the link is there necessarily, because I don't think that anyone, I don't know whether Hamas still claims at this point that the terror attacks of October 7 were a success, but I don't think you can make that claim now in any way if you look at what's happened to the Palestinian people.
And Hamas don't believe in a two-state solution. Hamas believe in the destruction of Israel.
They've been pretty clear on that.
Yeah, so they believe in the destruction of Israel. So a two-state solution would be predicated on a Palestinian authority, a Palestinian government that accepted Israel as a neighbour who could live in peace and security. And that's the essence of a two-state solution. You'd be looking to recognise a Palestinian state that had one government, not one government in Gaza and one government in the West Bank. It would be a unified Palestinian Authority that would have to represent a Palestinian state in negotiations with an Israeli state on the basis that Israel has the right to live in peace and security with its neighbour.
Just to follow up on that, William, is this ultimately, and I mean the ultimate being Palestine's full accession to the United Nations, is that going to be the United States call, and is there any prospect of the US ever getting off the fence on that?
Well, it won't happen until the US doesn't exercise its veto, and I think they're unlikely to refrain from exercising the veto anytime soon. I think if there were genuine peace talks and there was a one Palestinian government which accepted Israel as a partner, accepted the security and existence of Israel, and I think in those circumstances I could see the United States recognising a Palestinian state.
Well, let's take a look now at Afghanistan, which, for reasons requiring no recap, probably languishes somewhere near the bottom of most people's lists of dream vacations. However, the Taliban, despite being the principal reason that most prospective tourists regard Afghanistan at barge pole length, are pitching for holiday makers, especially from China. The Taliban's official spokesgoon, Zabihullah Mujahid, vouchsafed that, and I quote, "attention has been paid to peace and order in the area where tourists go. Everywhere else is presumably having to take its chances." Marion, are you tempted?
I'm personally not tempted, I have to say, but I do see where they're coming from insofar as that Afghanistan is an incredibly beautiful country, and those government-sponsored tours are probably very safe insofar as that they are probably, you know, accompanied by someone from the government or at least highly supervised. So you're not necessarily going to go off the beaten track and, I don't know, come across a group that you shouldn't come across. But yeah, at the same time, I mean, it's a bit suspect, and I'm not exactly sort of thrilled to go on a Taliban-sponsored holiday.
William, it is a country you know well. It is not a country I have visited for quite a long time. I went once during Taliban 1.0 and then again shortly afterwards in the early 2000s. As Marion says, it is an absolutely astonishingly beautiful country. The people really are as friendly as all heck, apart from the guys with the black turbans who are less so. The food's not bad. There's plenty, like, one of the enraging things about it is there's lots of stuff there that people would go to see. So if anybody is tempted, William, what would you recommend?
Well, I'd recommend you go to the downtown Kabul, which has been restored by a charity that I chair, Turquoise Mountain Trust, where you'll find an institute of culture and arts where people are engaging in ancient crafts, and the whole downtown area has been preserved. And I'd go up to Bamiyan. We're in the process of restoring a caravanserai there, so in the gateway to the Bamiyan Valley, where obviously I don't know why the Taliban want to promote people to go to Bamiyan, because as soon as you go,
they blew up the biggest reasons for going.
They blew up. Well, they blew up the Buddha statues. It's still a stunningly beautiful valley, and even the holes, the great gaps in the hillside where the Taliban, where the Buddhas once were, are still spectacular. So it's well worth seeing. I don't think that there's going to be a rush of tourists anytime soon.
Is there an argument, Marion, and it is something I have always wondered about, because in reporting from Afghanistan and a few similarly rickety places, it has occurred to me more than once that really I'm here as a journalist, but I'm basically a tourist with a press card and a certain license to ask people irritating questions. Is there an argument that going as a tourist to a place you might charitably describe as off the beaten path is actually a good thing to do, because you're spending money which is doing its little bit to gee up the local economy? You are bringing people news and ideas from the outside world. Is it necessarily a bad thing? I think people get a bit squeamish about the idea of what is called dark tourism, as if it's in somehow poor taste.
Tourism income is so important for a lot of countries, and I think there's so much to be said for that. I think what gives me more pause is why tourists go to these things. Like if someone goes because they're genuinely interested in the culture, because they want to see a different country, because they want to experience a different way of life, then I'd say go for it. But what you can sometimes get with people who purposefully seek out countries that are less visited is that they maybe aren't so respectful, or they're looking for a certain kind of adventure, and it comes with some sort of exoticization, which I think can be probably very annoying for locals, and is also just a little weird.
And possibly very annoying, I'm sure, William, for the British ambassador. Did the phone ever ring at the embassy in Kabul or Khartoum or Baghdad because some idiot British tourist stag do had got a bit out of hand?
Well, just as you were saying that, I was thinking, the number of tourists I had to deal with, the guy who wants to cycle through Iraq, and the cyclists who want to come through Sudan, the number of times you've had to deal with what I regard as complete idiots coming to somewhere because it's impassable, and expecting the British Embassy to rescue them the moment they get into trouble.
What do you say to somebody who calls you up saying, I want to cycle across Iraq? The temptation to say, well, good luck with that must be extreme.
Professional etiquette requires that I point out the difficulties, the need for visas, and the problems that they might encounter.
Just finally, before we move off this one, I do want to ask you each in turn. I'll ask you, Marion, if you have, it might even be Skopje, any tips for a perhaps unlikely holiday destination? See, whenever I was asked 15, 20 years ago, I always used to say Albania, but Albania now is basically downright civilised and pleasant. So I need to think of somewhere else.
Well, I actually was going to say Albania. I think North Macedonia as well. I think the Balkans generally, at least from a Western European perspective, are easily accessible. And, if you don't go to Croatia or Montenegro, the other countries are a lot less touristy. There's a lot of beautiful countryside to explore, and you have to engage with things that actually fit very well with our next story, but also we're not so used to engaging with anymore, like needing cash and not necessarily being able to use Google Maps to get around. So I think that's a much safer way to have a bit of an adventure rather than, trying to cycle through Iraq or getting abducted in the mountains in Afghanistan or something like that.
The first time I went to the Balkans, my only guide was a 2-year-old copy of Let's Go Europe, which had mostly been written by somebody who I think spent their entire research trip drunk. William, do you have an off-the-beaten-track recommendation?
Well, it would have been off the beat, but it's now on the beat. Saudi Arabia, Medina Salah, where the desert of Saudi Arabia, the Nabatean ruins in Saudi Arabia. If you want to escape the crowds of Petra, you go to Alula. But now the Saudis are giving visas to everybody, and you can go there at the drop of a hat now. So I don't think there is an off-the-beaten-track anymore.
The place will just be overrun with riffraff. Moving along, it is one of the consolations of advancing years ideas that one is able to enjoy, deriding everything young people do, say or think as daft, ridiculous and or insane. However, according to a new survey by some or other attention-seeking corporation who we are going to spite by not naming, the youth, or at least a significant plurality thereof, have at least one thing entirely right: an extreme reluctance to answer the phone. A quarter of people aged 18 to 34 do not pick up when called. Reasonably, 70% of those surveyed said they would prefer a text message. Less reasonably, 37% said they actually favoured voice notes, like anybody but an utter psychopath would ever send one. Marion, as the representative at this table of the younger folk, where are you on this?
So I really recognise not wanting to pick up the phone, especially if it's an unknown number. I mean, I feel like I get so many spam calls that if I don't recognise the number, I'm not expecting a call, I don't pick up. But I do really like a good catch-up call with friends and family. And I also spent, the first year of my career basically working in a customer service role that included a lot of cold phone calls to various people. So I think that trained me out of a lot of nervousness around phone calls, because I had to be very chipper about selling school planners to various schools.
See, William, you and I are both of a vintage, and this is what I'm wondering now, is where the crossover happened, because I can recall, and I'm sure you can as well, the phone ringing being an occasion of great excitement. It's like, wow, fantastic, the phone's ringing.
Somebody wants to talk to me.
Someone wants to speak to me. Who is this? How exciting. Whereas now, I think the most common default reflection is, well, to paraphrase Dorothy Parker's alleged phone greeting whenever she picked up, which was, what fresh hell is this?
Well, I have to say, I have a great one for communicating with people. I prefer the spoken word to the written word. I prefer to talk to people. But you're really out of touch. This doesn't work in radio. I was discussing with my sons the other day the universal sign for a phone call, where you're holding up the end of an old Bakelite phone, and even the new one with the fingers open. My sons tell me it's the palm of a hand. You hold the palm of a hand to the side of your ear. That's the indication of a phone call. So I'm in a whole new world of recognition, but I have to say I took some comfort from the fact that 75% of them would answer the phone.
See, thinking back on it though, Marion, and it didn't strike me at the time when a phone, indeed a landline, was all there was. The phone rang and you picked it up. And then it started to occur to me when there became more options like email and text messages and so on. Is it not an incredibly rude thing to do, to ring somebody up? Because when you just call somebody, you are implicitly asserting you have nothing better to do right now than speak to me, or whatever it is you're already doing is less important than talking to me. I mean, that's fair enough. People are welcome to call me if they're trapped under a wardrobe and they think I can help them in some way. But other than that, it's an imposition, isn't it?
It is in a way, yeah, and that's actually a huge difference between how my parents and I deal with phone calls. Like if I'm at my parents' house and my phone is lying somewhere and it rings, my mom will invariably run through the house being like, "Oh, your phone is ringing," whereas I'm like, "That's fine, I'll check it later. I'll get back to them." So I think that's really interesting. But something that the story actually didn't talk about, but that one of my colleagues was telling me, who has a tween child, that even though apparently the kids don't love phone calls, but they love FaceTime. And she asked her daughter, what if you don't want to be on video? Like, what if you just woke up? What if you're not feeling well? And the daughter said, that's fine, then you just turn the video off, which to me is the same as a phone call. But apparently the kids are okay with that. They just don't like the actual phone call.
Just a final question on this, William, and it is a question of decorum, possibly justice. Those people who do leave voice messages, should they be boiled in oil or merely horsewhipped?
Oh no, I think they're fine.
Really? You're insane.
I actually have a voice message which people comment on. If you phone me and I don't answer, you get MI6's Miss Moneypenny telling you that I'm not available and I'm saving the world. And please leave a message. I'm very old school.
Are you the last person on earth who has a zany novelty answering message?
I paid 300 quid for this, for the actual Miss Moneypenny who recorded that message. I'm not giving it up. I paid 300 quid to charity for that.
Sir William Patey and Dr. Marion Messmer, thank you both for joining us. Finally on today's show, it is time for our weekly letter from, and today it's Monocle's Vincent McAvenny in Mexico City.
Inflation is up, gas prices up, and Americans are worried. Their worry is up as well when it comes to financial
security. This morning's CPI report showed a larger than expected rise in inflation.
Yeah, so many businesses, of course, impacted this year.
Over the past 5 years, the stories of cities in North America have been increasingly depressing. Their pandemic epilogues have been cyclic tales of decline. In many, like Portland, San Francisco and Washington, D.C., collapsed businesses are hollowing out central districts. Streets have boarded up stores, diminishing footfall. Huge expansions of homeless encampments, coupled with the explosion of fentanyl use, creating tragic zombie-like scenes.
Battle against the fentanyl crisis.
Rising crime then deterring visitors, leading to restaurants, cafes and bars shuttering. There's little doubt with enough effort these cities, which have bounced back from crisis periods before, will do so again. But for now, other overlooked cities get to bask in some of the spotlight. Mexico City's post-pandemic chapter isn't following this script. The country bucked the trend of battening down the hatches and enforcing strict lockdowns during the COVID years, remaining largely open and welcoming to remote workers and visitors. That's meant an influx of new residents and tourists discovering, like myself this month, that the city is not what you expect. Geographically, it's a high-altitude, sprawling metropolis in a former lake basin, hemmed in by a ring of mountains and volcanoes. A settlement for indigenous people since the 1300s, when it was called Tenochtitlan. Rapid expansion in the 20th century and regular earthquakes have led to sharp contradictions in architectural styles, along with the odd ruin as well. It's a brash, bold and understandably boisterous mix, given its 22.5 million residents, which make it the 5th largest city in the world. Neighbourhoods like Palenque, Roma and Coyoacán have their own distinct flavours, quite literally with the vast array of street food, making it hard to pigeonhole this capital. Churros fry and quesadillas sizzle on street corners outside cosy cafes. Tunes from mariachi and sequin sombreros drift through the air as couples of all ages practice their dancing in parks and plazas. Tower blocks cast long shadows over Baroque churches and Aztec ruins studded with cacti. Mexico City simultaneously conforms to every stereotype and challenges every preconception with shameless self-assurance. Whilst many capitals feel the need to be chronically self-deprecating, Mexico City's confidence is refreshing, making it all the more surprising that this city recently pulled out of hosting the 2036 Olympic Games. The country previously hosted the event in 1968, so it had pedigree. Structurally, it boasts an impressive public transport system, and like Paris this summer, could have managed it with facility upgrades, not big builds, making it a more sustainable contender. But up against South Korea, India, Egypt and Qatar, the country's bid team shockingly deemed the competition too tough. That may in part be due to Egypt's campaign cry that it's time for Africa to finally host the Games. But I worry it's in reaction to Qatar's ability to outspend the whole field. But the idea of another frankly sterilised global event like the 2022 Football World Cup in Qatar, bogged down by controversies over workers' rights and the treatment of LGBTQ+ people, fills me with dread. Mexico City's transformation in the past decade makes it worth commendation because it feels like a true partnership between municipal government and residents. Successive mayoralities have installed better streetlights, more security cameras, refurbished parks, mended pavements and added playgrounds. Infrastructure investment has helped too. 12 years ago, it was among the world's worst cities for traffic and consequently air pollution. But today the situation has calmed. Bike sharing schemes abound and a better Metrobus route has helped the population move and breathe more easily. In a country with several regions flagged by the UK's Foreign Office as no-go zones, the sense of security in the capital countered my expectations, aided in part by reforming and improving the police service, evident from their highly visible but friendly and reassuring presence on pretty much every street in the centre. But whilst all this bureaucracy has no doubt played its part, for me it was the people's proactive engagement with their city that was so impressive. Locals, known as Chilangos, feel a sense of ownership of their public spaces, not just the parks and plazas buzzing with community activity, but even the pavements they walk on. It's normal for owners of street-facing businesses and properties to maintain their little sections of sidewalk themselves. You'll regularly see people, not municipal workers, out washing the concrete or cobbles and clearing away the rubbish. Combined, these little acts of civic care add to streets which felt cleaner and tidier than many in the US and Europe, adding to the sense of safety and security. Mexico City also offers visitors green spaces aplenty, every street seemingly being filled with trees and immaculate planting. Stay long enough, though, and you'll realise it's not just the army of city-employed gardeners in their distinctive green and yellow jumpsuits tending to all this, but often you spot locals pruning and watering, and then sitting on the benches to admire their work. A ban on drinking in the streets also helps keep the atmosphere orderly, and on Sundays, the shutting down of some of the capital's busiest avenues for people to just jog, cycle and skate gives ownership back to those living in the neighbourhoods, not just the cars passing through. Like any city, it still has its issues, and the recent influx of digital nomads has prompted the usual accusations of inflating prices and expulsion of local tenants. But in Mexico, it was charming to see a capital proud of itself and willing to roll up its sleeves to improve in a partnership between Chilangos and City Hall. From Monocle in Mexico City, I'm Vincent McAviney.
Thank you, Vincent. And that is all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Sir William Patey and Dr. Marion Messmer. The show was produced by Carlotta Rebello and researched by George Ruskin. Our sound engineer was Lily Austin. I'm Andrew Mueller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.